Dr. Thomas Homer-Dixon is an author, social scientist, and the executive director of the Cascade Institute. He uses complexity science to understand better the diverse threats facing humankind and how they might be addressed. And I'll just say I've been following your work for about a decade, and I think it's amazing, and it's really helped me understand I'll just say the systemic threats that we're facing, and I think there are some big ones out there now. And so even as we do our work at the local level and even higher than that, I think we just need to be aware of these because it makes us much more strategic in achieving our goals. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Well, I'm really delighted to be here with you this morning. I've been given an extraordinarily challenging task, basically, to try to make sense of the world, to give some order to chaos in 20 minutes. Listening to the conversation this morning, I sense a degree of bewilderment in this world of wicked problems and challenges that we are facing, all of us. And that bewilderment is entirely understandable, but it is possible to peel away the layers and understand some of the mechanisms underneath, and that's what we try to do at the Cascade Institute, try to understand some of the forces driving the extraordinary political, economic, and social changes we're seeing in the world today. Let's go to the next slide. Oh. That's right, I have a clicker here. The last presentation I did, I had to actually tell people. So we are in a situation of bewildering change, as I've just mentioned. If you think about what we have encountered over the last 6 or 7 years, it really does seem like the world is going haywire. Wildfires sweeping the planet, a pandemic, a zoonotic viral disease that fundamentally changed the course of human civilization. I'm just ticking through the years here, coming up to the present. A major war in Eastern Europe, a battle really fundamentally between authoritarianism and liberal democracy. Climate change having extraordinary impacts all over the planet. In this case, Pakistan, almost a third of the country was underwater from storms in August 2022. The largest migrations that humankind has ever seen in history outside the periods of major warfare in the last century. Again, the drumbeat of, rising political authoritarianism, not just in the United States, but around the world, populist nationalism. And again, the drumbeat of climate change, seemingly getting steadily worse. It is getting steadily worse around the planet. So at the Cascade Institute, one of the tools we use to understand what's happening is what we call a polycrisis framework. We characterize this situation as a set of converging crises, interconnected and entangled crises. And the fundamental question we're asking is sort of captured by this cartoon here is, are these connections, is this just a matter of coincidence? And this is just a perfect storm, and if we wait long enough, this stuff will just kind of go away? Or are there synchronizing factors, causal mechanisms that are causing these things all to happen simultaneously? And our hypothesis at the Cascade Institute, and I'm not going to go into this in tremendous detail, but this is the first, I guess you could say, analytical framework I'm providing you. Our hypothesis is that yes, these forces are connected in powerful ways that in many respects we can't see clearly. It's not just a perfect storm, it's not just an unhappy coincidence. The model that we use to understand these these relationships between the various shocks that our world is experiencing is what we call a stress trigger crisis model, STC model. And you can see at the top there represented schematically. We think of stresses as being long-term, often global processes that are data-rich. We can project their trajectories over time. These are things like climate heating, demographic change, long-term economic changes and technological changes. These are processes that we have some capacity to predict, and they operate basically quite slowly. But to get a crisis, you need a trigger event. You need something to spark the change. And that little multiplication sign you see there, you can think of that as if you know Boolean logic, you can think of it as a Boolean AND operator. It's stipulating that you need the stresses and the trigger in order to get the crisis. And triggers are local events. They're often very short term. You think of an assassination or a bankruptcy or a major storm. And this local event, these local events, they're specific to a time and place, short term, and substantially unpredictable. So we would call them stochastic. It tends to be a focus on trigger events when we're looking at changes in our world, but instead we really should be paying attention to the long-term stresses, these deep forces that are changing the probability landscape that we're sitting on as a species and as civilizations. And that's what the lower diagram is really representing. This is what complexity scientists would call a stability landscape. And you can think of any particular system, the climate or the economy, as being represented, the state of that system as being represented by a ball that is sitting on a landscape with dips in it. And it naturally tends to migrate towards the bottom of one of those dips. That's what would be called an energy minimum. For those of you who are ecologists, this is a situation where you have an equilibrium. You've got homeostatic mechanisms that are stabilizing the system. You can think of an economy or a climate or an ecology. But what the stresses do over time is they make this basin of attraction, as complexity scientists call it, this equilibrium shallower and less stable. They reduce the resilience of the system, making it easier for smaller and smaller trigger events to knock the system out of that equilibrium into another state. And it's the intervening period between two stable states, which we describe as a crisis at the Cascade Institute. It's a period of high uncertainty, high instability in the system. So that's the basic model we use in our polycrisis work to understand the underlying dynamics of our world, this STC model. And then an important part, if the stresses are so important, is to come up with a list of stresses. And this is a working list. We're actually undertaking a major project. We call it our global stress analysis. Probably ultimately the list will be a bit longer than this, but you're familiar with most of this stuff. If you look at the world of, the work of organizations such as the World Economic Forum, that has its annual conference in Davos, Switzerland in January, you'll see similar lists. Risk analysts tend to produce these kinds of lists, but they're not often analytically very rigorous. We're trying to make this much more rigorous. You'll notice at the top of the list, we're dealing with material and natural processes for the most part, and they're of particular concern to you. Item 2, biodiversity loss and ecological degradation. And as you move towards the bottom, you're getting into more social stresses and stresses that implicate what's going on in the human mind. And they're less material and more ideational, as we would call it. I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'm going to talk about, in the next section of my talk, I'm going to talk about 3 in particular that relate to the particular political and social moment that we have in North America. But I do want to point out a couple of things. You'll notice, for instance, in stress 5 and stress 7, there are 2 qualifying adjectives, high uniformity and high connectivity in both cases. First for the global food supply and second for the global financial system. Complexity scientists have shown that when you get high uniformity and connectivity in a system, you're much more likely to have cascading failures in that system, knock-on effects that can damage pole systems. This is basically a monocrop phenomenon. You can think of having a field planted with a similar strain of corn. The stalks are very close together. So that represents high connectivity in the system. The genetic similarity or the identical genetic characteristics of the corn means that if a pathogen or a blight enters from one side of the field, it has the same effect on every plant, and it can skip from one plant to the next. We see this kind of combination of homogeneity and high connectivity in many of the systems human beings have created around the world: financial systems, food systems, international information technology systems, and the like. And it's one of the reasons that we see occasions of cascading failures across these systems, and we expect we'll see more of those in the future. Now, I said I would talk specifically about some forces that are affecting the political and social moment in North America right now, and that we heard about this morning and that we're all wondering about and trying to deal with in our various respects. So I'll focus on these three stresses and their implications: slowing economic growth and widening economic inequalities, ideological polarization, and what we call epistemic fragmentation, which basically means the decline of a belief in a shared reality that we can use to adjudicate our claims about truth and reality, and then the spread of populist authoritarian ideology. So we're moving from our polycrisis framework, which, if you're interested in knowing more, is fully elaborated on the Cascade Institute website at cascadeinstitute.org, to our framework on democratic decline and ideological polarization. And this looks hard, but it isn't, and I'm going to walk you through it. This is the second tool that I'm using today, second analytical tool. What we've identified in our own work is 4 distinct causal processes that are driving democratic decline, social polarization, and ideological polarization. And I'm going to walk through each one of these 4 processes briefly. And again, all of this information is provided at greater length on the Cascade Institute website. So let's start with the first one. I'm not going to say a huge amount about each of these. Some of them you'll be quite familiar with. Actually, I'm going to go back very quickly and just point one thing out. 4 processes vertically. I'll talk about each of them individually in a moment. But I want to point out that as you go from the left to the right, again, you're going from sort of material forces relating to economic changes in wealth and income distribution and the like, through to, on the right-hand side, more ideational changes, things that are happening in people's heads. We know a lot about the stuff on the left, focus of an enormous amount of research and commentary. We know much less about what's happening on the right. But we would argue at the Cascade Institute that these forces are equally potent and in fact are significantly implicated in connections with the forces on the left. Okay, so let's talk about these very quickly individually. The first is a well-documented changes in the nature of production, technologies of production that have contributed to widening income and wealth gaps within societies, greater returns to basically knowledge and ideational capital as opposed to labor, physical labor especially. I don't like to prioritize, as I was just mentioning, any one of these processes over others, but if I had to choose one factor that is driving the rise of populist authoritarians like Donald Trump in the world, it would be this factor. Here we're looking at the decline in real income per capita growth rates over the last 60 years, and you can see it's been quite remarkable. What we did with these statistics, which is a bit unusual, is we removed the exogenous shocks during the oil crises in the 1970s, the 2008-2009 financial crisis, the COVID crisis. These were fluctuations in economic growth and productivity globally that were largely unrelated to the underlying dynamics of the economic system. And when you remove those outliers, you get a very clear trend. For those of you who know statistics, the R-squared on this is about 0.6, which is exceptionally high for any social science trend. And we've declined from somewhere around 4% growth rates a year in real income per Canada during the 1960s to just over 1% now. And what has happened during that process is that wealthy and powerful groups have used their wealth and power to influence governments, to influence the state, states in ways to hold on to their share of the pie, or even to keep their shares of the pie growing, despite the fact that the whole pie is growing much more slowly. And so the burden of this decline in income has been disproportionately borne by weaker, politically weaker, and economically poorer groups within our societies. The major factor driving economic discontent that has been exploited by authoritarian populists. And then these processes, as I say, are well documented and understood in works like this, some of which you've probably heard of. But let's go on to the second causal process, which relates to work I did almost 30 years ago, a book I published in 2000 called The Ingenuity Gap. It basically makes the argument in very simple terms, represented by this graph, that our problems are becoming more complex faster than we're delivering solutions to them. And it has a very specific way of thinking about the rising complexity of problems, climate change, economic problems, widened income gaps, zoonotic viral diseases and the like. And it has a specific way of thinking about rising complexity of these problems and a very specific way of thinking about society's capacity to deliver solutions and the quality of those solutions in response. And the argument basically is that we're not keeping up with the rising difficulty of our problems at the national or global levels. And the result is that those groups and individuals with whom we have charged as societies to take care of us, groups of technocrats, governments, bureaucrats, state institutions and the like, who are demonstrably not doing so because these problems like climate change and economic precarity, healthcare crises and the like are getting worse. They have seen a dramatic decline in their legitimacy, their moral authority within our societies. People asked quite recently, why are we giving you so much status and wealth if you're not doing your jobs and if you're not solving these problems? And this is a less remarked phenomenon, but we believe it's very powerful in driving a lot of the discontent within our societies. The third phenomenon is one that has received a lot of attention, but in disparate and somewhat disconnected ways, and this relates to social media and the flows of information in our society, and the relationship between those flows of information and our human cognitive capacity to absorb information and sort through it. There's quite a long causal story here that I'm not going to go into in detail because I'm running towards the end of my time. But basically, the issue here is that in the last 40 years, we have seen an absolutely phenomenal increase in the flows of information within our societies. Each of us has literally billions of fold more information than we had available back individually in the 80s or early 1990s. Our cognitive processing hasn't changed at all for the most part, so all of this information is piling up at the doorsteps to our cerebral cortexes. And one of the phenomena as a result is that we tend to shorten our messages. And if we want to get attention in a hyper-scarce attention environment, we tend to pump those messages up with emotion. To get attention, we shorten them. We make them more emotionally intensive. And the emotions that get the most attention are negative emotions: fear, disgust, and anger. And so there's a natural tendency for people's messages to be shorter, more emotionally intensive, with more negative emotions, and to focus those negative emotions on outgroups, groups other than one's own, within social media as a way of gaining social status. Get more friends, more likes, etc., more followers. And this is one of the things that's been driving the echo chamber phenomena on social media. I could say more about this particular causal process, but you're familiar with some of the underlying mechanisms already from lots of commentary in this space, but we see it as a discrete phenomenon. And then finally, something that doesn't get much attention at all, but we think is incredibly important, is what we call fragmentation of belief communities. Within our own work, we call this epistemic fragmentation. It's basically the erosion of the idea that we have a shared reality that we can use, as I mentioned before, as a reference point for adjudicating our claims about what's true and what's not true, basically through institutions such as science. And we have, there's an article in the New York Times this morning, quite extraordinary, talking about the rise of belief in conspiracy theories to the top of the Trump administration. Secretary Kennedy has launched an investigation into the reality of chemtrails. The deputy director of the FBI believes in demons and believes that demon energy is a real thing, quote unquote. Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, thinks that fires are caused by lasers from space. Wildfires caused by lasers from space. But these are just more extreme phenomena and forms of this kind of conspiracy thinking and disinformation. Underneath the surface, though, we've had a long-term, multi-decadal process of the erosion of a commitment to a shared reality, which we call, as I say, epistemic fragmentation. And that makes it really hard to solve a problem like climate change or to do your jobs, such as get people committed to protecting biodiversity when people simply won't believe the arguments and data that you're providing. Okay, could say a lot more about this. Let me just indicate where this all leads us. All of these things are connected together, of course, and you can draw, when we do this in the Cascade Institute, we have arrows going back and forth between all of these phenomena, and I've just shown a few possible connections there. Underneath this, all these four processes create a social selection environment within our societies that favor, this is a fancy way of pointing to these political authoritarians that I have talked about so far, opportunistic actors who are willing to leverage intergroup conflict to accumulate social, economic, and political power. And this, in turn, worsens ideological polarization, deepens social divisions, and produces a greater likelihood of dehumanization dynamics, rising populism, and weakening democratic governance. This is not necessarily a complete story, but we think that we have a fair amount, as they would say in the social sciences, a fair amount. We're explaining a fair amount of the variance in the system at this point, and we are undertaking a major research project to try to stress test this model and make sure it's effectively empirically grounded and make sure we're not missing anything critically important. So let's just step back because we want to have a little bit of time for conversation. What does this do? It makes us really scared. All these phenomena make us really scared. Even understanding them, I'm still scared. But if you don't understand them and you're just surrounded by this bewildering world of wicked problems and complexity where things seem to be going wrong all the time, you're afraid. The fear is very quickly associated or generates anger, and folks like this fellow take advantage of that in order to build their political and social power. And I'm sorry if there are people who are supporters of Donald Trump in this room, but I'm not. And I think these phenomena around the world are phenomenally dangerous. Is it game over? I don't think so, for a variety of reasons. First of all, the reason you do this kind of thing is because good diagnosis has to precede effective prescription. You actually have to know what's going on causally underneath the surface before you can start to identify the intervention points where you can go in and try to change these dynamics. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done if you take this kind of approach seriously. And I'd like to think, as I was listening to folks this morning, that your groups can play a role in finding leverage points and pushing on them to try to change some of these phenomena. So biodiversity and conservation are essential to economic well-being. That's not understood by for instance, your municipal leaders, as was being discussed earlier. There's an enormous amount of misinformation and disinformation out there operating in the two right-hand columns. There's a story that needs to be told and arguments that need to be made about the relationship between biodiversity and conservation and reducing economic precarity in the left column. And there's vitally important things that need to be done in correcting misinformation about these issues in the right two columns. And that's an important job for everybody in this room, where you can start to identify those points as people were discussing this morning, where you can press and perhaps make a real difference. If you want to know more about that particular model, it's in this document on the Cascade Institute website, Defending Canada's Democracy. We originally wanted to label this Defending Liberal Democracy because it's really a global phenomenon. This model has global relevance. It applies equally to the United States or to Europe as it does to Canada. And what we did in this particular document, it says it's a strategic framework. We actually used the model and one other analytical device, which I haven't gone into today, to identify a 12-cell matrix where you can specify specific interventions in societies in order to respond to these causal processes. And at the end, you'll find the last table we've taken that 12 cells and we've put into that table 18 possible interventions that would have major effect on Canada. And this is now on the Prime Minister's desk in Ottawa. The key thing here is to make sure that these interventions are connected with each other in synergistic ways. So much of our work is so isolated, and we're not paying attention to what else is going on in the system, so we miss the opportunities for integrative, synergistic effects across multiple interventions at different scales and levels within our societies. Complex systems science tells us that isolated, siloed approaches to problems aren't going to work. And what we're trying to do with this framework is provide a platform on which we can think about connected responses across multiple groups at multiple levels of our societies. Okay, I'm going to finish with something, stepping back to look at the global level, something that we're all looking for hope, and this is where I find some of my hope in this world. The situation that the humankind is in right now is unique. It's sui generis. We've never experienced this in the history of the species, which means we have really no idea what's going to happen over the next number of decades. We're living in an extraordinarily nonlinear world. Change is accelerating. We're seeing more sudden shifts in systems, almost on a weekly basis, it seems sometimes. And some of those shifts and opportunities in the future will be positive ones if we're ready to take advantage of them. And I'd just like to highlight three particular things. The level of connectivity within the human systems around the planet is completely unparalleled. Between beginning of March 2020 and the end of March 2020, half the world's population locked down. The concept of social distancing or physical distancing went global and changed people's behavior all over the planet. Never in human history has such a large proportion of the human population changed its behavior so fast. And that was a function of the connectivity, information connectivity we have at the global level. We have abundant scientific knowledge that actually tells us a lot about the nature of the problems we're facing. As compared to, say, the period of the Black Death in the 14th century, when people really didn't understand the underlying etiology and mechanisms of the plague, we know exactly what's driving climate change, and we know what we need to do. We know exactly what's causing biodiversity crises, and we know what we need to do. We're not doing those things very effectively for the most part, but the knowledge is nonetheless there for the most part, even if a lot of people are starting to deny its reality and its validity. Again, to look at the COVID pandemic, just to give an indication of the nature of our shift in knowledge, availability, and application. Within 2 days of the Chinese downloading the RNA sequence for the SARS-CoV-2 virus in early January 2020, both Moderna and Pfizer had crunched the genetic code through their computers and had produced the morphology, the physical characteristics of the vaccine molecule. They knew what it needed to look like within 2 days. It took another 20 to 24 months to get a substantial fraction of the human population vaccinated. That was largely because of delays due to testing and making sure that the vaccine was working and it was safe. Nonetheless, even though it was unfair and disproportionate and wealthy groups and countries got much of the benefit, 40% of the world's population was vaccinated, I think, in about 2 years. The previous record for vaccinating 40% of the world's population for any disease was 80 years. That's an extraordinary change, and it's something that we have largely forgotten about in all of the controversy surrounding COVID. And then the final thing I would say is that I think there's a profound, we spend a lot of time in the Cascade Institute talking about ideational factors, what's going on in people's heads. I think there's a profound dispute or struggle, I think struggle is the right word, struggle in human civilization globally right now between a solidarity response and a response of division to the challenges we're facing. Because what we're seeing as we learn more about our world around us is absolutely inescapable data and information that we are profoundly connected on this planet. The smoke from the boreal wildfires in Siberia affects the whole planet. The smoke from the boreal wildfires or the wildfires here in BC spreads all the way to Europe. Zoonotic viral diseases know no boundaries. We can't solve problems like climate change and zoonotic viral disease pandemics unless we're cooperating and collaborating together on this planet. But the response of those who are manipulating fear and anger in our societies is to tell us that we can build walls, that we can solve these problems by simply creating barriers between ourselves and our societies and the rest of the world. That isn't going to work. We all know that. Everybody in this room knows that because that's your business. But this awareness of common fate is fundamentally influencing whether and how we see ourselves as a common we on this planet, if we see ourselves as having a species-wide identity. I think it's an open story as to whether ultimately we're going to recognize that we live on a very small planet together, and that if we're going to live, we're going to live together. Otherwise, we're going to die together. And the wealthy of us who try to shut ourselves off in gated communities and wherever, out in the sea somewhere on a manufactured floating island in a gated community in New Zealand or in a silo in the Dakotas, are simply going to have a couple extra, maybe if they're lucky, decades, or maybe a decade, to watch the world disintegrate around them. That doesn't sound like very much fun. So I think that the debate, really, the struggle in our minds right now is whether we're going to pull together around these problems or whether we're going to fall apart. And I think all of you are playing a really central role in that conversation, and I know what side you're on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We don't have a lot of time for questions. We'll have to eat into our break, but I would like to maybe ask you a question, but I want to throw out a question to the rest of you to think about over the course of the symposium. So in summary of what I've heard this morning, there is a lot of optimism in the room about what's happening. Many of us are really focused at the local level. We heard from Dallas and Stephen this morning about their work over generations and how over time the political system, political machinations haven't really made a huge difference in their success. But I want to point out that even though we've accomplished a lot as a community over many decades, and it's really hard to quantify what we've protected and what we've prevented from happening, but we are still in a losing slide. For example, the fossil fuels are still 80% of our energy resource. That has not changed over 40 years, even though there's a lot more renewable energy on the ground. And so there is this sort of lack of awareness gap, both at the municipal and policymaker level about the importance of biodiversity in the economy, but also on our part in terms of what those larger global systems mean for our ability to be successful on the ground. So there's a lack of awareness going in both directions, I think. A couple people mentioned this morning getting out of our comfort level, taking a good look at our own assumptions and beliefs. And so I think we're all aware of this. At the same time, I struggle with how do we as a community actually respond to these larger global forces and make sure that our work is reflecting those. So that's a question that I'm sort of posing to you, but I'm also posing it to all of you as a community. How do we step out of our comfort level? How do we do some real self-reflection about what it will take for us to do things a little bit differently moving forward and take advantage of the scary yet opportunistic space that we're in at the moment?
So let me just say something very quickly about that. My wife and I have two children, Kate, who's 17, and Ben, who is 20. Ben just actually ran for the Green Party on Vancouver Island in the riding beside Elizabeth Mays. What I tell them, because they're desperately worried, like I think any receptive and sensible young person is nowadays, what I tell them in their moments of despair is that what we were doing in the past wasn't working. If you look at the Keeling curve, the increase in concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there's no indication, despite 40 years of effort, that there's really any change in the trajectory of that curve. So things were going to break, and they're in the process of breaking. And breaking can create opportunities for very radical change, both negative, often negative, but also potentially positive. And one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up the chart, Leslie, and I mentioned this at one point, but I'd just like to emphasize it again, is I think it helps folks, for instance, in this community, identify where they can play a role, right? And I think that your municipal councilors, for instance, to pick up on something I heard earlier, don't understand the economic importance of biodiversity and conservation. They don't understand that our economies depend fundamentally on healthy ecosystems and a climate that is providing, for instance, sufficient rainfall at the right times. So the relationship between these aren't sort of ancillary or fringe issues you're talking about. The relationship between them and human well-being is really central to dealing with the economic precarity problem. And we heard about the industries at the local level within Indigenous communities and elsewhere that are relying upon these resources to deal with economic precarity issues. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that there is a fight going on for whether people believe in science. And you have a central role in that fight. You have a central role in communicating the empirical data and the reality of the biodiversity and conservation crisis. And we can't just throw up our hands when the going gets rough and walk away from it. We have to engage, and now you're engaging, and I can see that. And I guess the last thing I'd say, and this may be a bit controversial outside the comfort zone, is that we are in a profoundly political moment. This is a political situation. This is about power, who uses it, who gets to cut the grants, who gets to provide the resources to whom. And if you try to isolate yourselves from that, if you try to deny that it is a political moment and it's about the distribution and use of power within our societies, and what normative ends that power is used for, then you are electing to be out of the game, and that's a tough choice, either way, to be in or out. But we have to make it, and even if you don't think you're making it, you are making it.
Great. Thank you very much. All right. We need to break.
Should we give an extra 5 minutes for the break and come back at 10:35 sharp? We're doing pretty good this morning. That was rich food for thought. Get more food and coffee. And we'll see you back here at 10:35. Thank you.